Systems theory. System thinking has a prehistory in Indigenous thought as the idea that all are related. But as a formal scientific pursuit, it emerged only during the 20th century. Previously, Western scientists assumed that they could understand systems by analyzing their parts. So that's a bit like understanding photosynthesis without understanding the tree as a system itself, which exists within a forest, which is itself a system, which exists within a larger ecosystem, which exists within the biosphere. The human body is a system that is itself composed of systems, and the human body exists within much larger social and ecological systems. The same can be said of a nation or a city or a company. So we have systems existing within systems, overlapping with other systems, existing within ever larger systems. And so, of course, all of these systems interact. There are the systems of the human body, which are affected by the systems that the human body exists within. Things like the climate system, for example, or the hydrologic system, and so on and so on and so forth. Just a quick review. I believe this was covered in the article I asked you to read. But all systems have some sort of boundary. Now, these boundaries aren't impermeable. They are semi-permeable. So there is some sort of a separation between the system and everything outside the system, but things can get in and move outside of those boundaries. There are inputs, things like energy or information or materials that enter the system or move within the system. Outputs, perhaps work, waste heat and waste materials, flows in and out of the system, stocks, such as nutrients, resources, and other materials. And then we have these types of feedback. Positive feedback, also known as reinforcing feedback. So positive feedback isn't always a good thing. In fact, most of the time when we're talking about living systems and large systems, positive feedback is actually quite harmful. Positive feedback can act as a brake on something. If you cut your arm, your blood clots. And this is a type of positive feedback initiated by the body to stop this harm. But in many cases, a positive feedback reinforces a particular aspect of a system that can go on to create harm within that system or ultimately even destroy that system. Negative feedback, counterintuitively, is a stabilizing feedback. So most negative feedback is a good thing for the system. So if we look at the human body as a system, let's do that because that's something that we're all very familiar with. So if we think of the boundary, well, we could say that the skin is the boundary. And immediately you can understand, well, of course, the skin doesn't hold everything out and it doesn't hold everything in. There are things that come through the skin. There are things that leave out through the skin or other parts of the body. We might think of air and food and water as some of the inputs in this particular system. Outputs might be things like movement or work or waste. Flows, think of the breath in and out. A type of stock within the system might be the energy stored as fat in the body. Now let's talk a little bit about feedback because feedback is integral to understanding systems. So, one of the types of feedback that we have is negative feedback. And remember, negative feedback is stabilizing feedback. So it helps to stabilize a system. So we might think of the regulating systems within the body, the systems that help to keep our temperature at roughly 37 degrees Celsius. So nerve cells in the skin signal to the brain if that temperature is too high. For example, the brain might respond by activating the sweat glands and we might sweat. Or our blood vessels might dilate. If we're too cold, we might shiver or our blood vessels might constrict. So that's a type of stabilizing or negative feedback that controls one of the systems within the body system. An example of positive feedback or reinforcing feedback might be depression, for example. Depression is a good example of an illness that generates positive or reinforcing feedback. It might start with an environmental stressor. That environmental stressor might trigger an increase in cortisol or stress hormone production. Maybe that increase in cortisol leads to a decrease in sleep, as well as what's often referred to as negative cognitive representations, or interpretation of events in a negative way. This might lead to decreased physical activity, which in turn might lead to decreased sleep patterns again, more negative cognition, this all leading to decreased health, then perhaps decreased relationship health, which again leads in turn to perhaps again decreased physical activity and poor sleep and increased cortisol. This might lead to problems with economic status, eventually neurodegradation, as well as dysfunctional behaviors. And each of these behaviors triggers another behavior or disordered way that the body is behaving, which in turn makes everything else worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And you get into one of those reinforcing feedbacks. And when that happens, in the case of depression, we call that clinical depression. And usually there has to be something that comes in to change those feedbacks. So something to interrupt those reinforcing feedbacks. So depression is just one example of a reinforcing feedback that leads to poor health outcomes. There are, of course, many other examples. And temperature regulation is just one of the many, many stabilizing feedbacks that the human body or the human system has in place to regulate all of its many systems and keep everything working for, on average about 80, 85 years. So that's pretty miraculous.